Today I'm going to share with you 3 strategies that the super wealthy use to legally reduce their taxes and how you can adapt those strategies to use them in your own life and your own business. And so what I think people don't often understand is that if you are running a small business, whether it's $1 million, $5 million, $20 million business, that's a small business in comparison. Whether you are a small investor, you've got a dramatically different way in many ways of reducing your taxes than the super wealthy. And so whenever I watch these videos of how Warren Buffett lowers his taxes or how Jeff Bezos lowers his taxes, I not only find them very incomplete, I find them a little bit misleading in some cases, but I also find them to where this applies to a very small number of people in some cases. I'm going to walk you through 3 strategies that they talk about the super rich using and how you can adapt those for yourself. I'm Andrew Henderson. I'm the founder of Nomad Capitalist. We've spent a decade creating a group of experts both in-house and our network of attorneys and accountants and real estate experts around the world to help more than 1,000 high and ultra high net worth individuals legally reduce their taxes overseas, protect themselves with dual citizenship, and grow their opportunities internationally. You can learn more at nomadcapitalist.com. So the first thing the super rich do is they're building their companies in a global environment using offshore structures. Someone I saw online a while back explained it perfectly. They said, I ran the accounting division of a big company in one country. It was a multinational company. And we looked at how do we reduce our expenses. And so in these kind of soulless big corporations, it's all right, how do we reduce headcount? How do we get rid of people to reduce costs? How do we save money with suppliers? How do we extend payment deadlines? All that kind of stuff that, to me, if you're running a small business, doesn't really contribute to the vibe that you want to grow your business. But they also said, we treated tax just like an expense. So whether we're buying paper for the printers, whether we're paying, cleaning staff, or whether we're paying tax, we just manage the expense. We found legal ways to manage that expense, as everyone would want to do. Everyone who starts making big money that I meet, they're just like, hey, yeah, why am I paying so much in taxes? This is crazy. And so big companies, the super wealthy, the Mark Zuckerbergs, and all these big companies have offshore structures, and you have them in, Ireland and historically in Bermuda and the Cayman Islands and all over the world. Obviously, there's a new global minimum tax that is very slowly making its way to implementation, that these big companies would have to start paying some kind of minimum tax if they're over a certain revenue threshold. You can do the same thing, and at least for now, won't be subject to these new taxes that may or may not come into play, but not the same way. One of the mistakes people make is they say, oh, well, Mark Zuckerberg's in California, he's in Hawaii, he's living in the United States. He's running a big company, right? Starbucks, all these companies. And people think, oh, I'm going to sell my intellectual property to some place in the British Virgin Islands. I'm going to lease it back for some obscene price. And even in more flexible jurisdictions, this is just not really going to work. So you've got intellectual property. Do you really? I mean, Facebook has intellectual property. Starbucks has intellectual property. And they're doing very advanced calculations. Yes, they have people in the United States. But your small business, you're going to need to, in most cases, move outside of your country. If you've got partners, probably a good idea if everybody's moving outside of the country. Whenever we have people that come into us who want to create a holistic international plan, one of the hardest things we have to do is, hey, I got 2 other partners. Hey, this one guy, he really wants to stay in Canada. It's like, well, that makes it a lot more difficult. And so that's a strike against partners, and it's also a strike against investors, by the way, who want to structure companies in certain ways that are not as international friendly. But we're creating holistic plans for our clients that take into account the fact that they need to generally move overseas. And so especially if you're an American, there's a need for a holistic plan, but really for everybody, you're going to need to leave your country and figure out how to get out of that country. If you're an American, you can still claim a number of different tax incentives by being outside of the country. If you're not an American, you can simply leave the country's tax net. But how do you do that legally? How do you do that properly? And then where do you go and set yourself up? So that's what we're helping people do with our attorneys and other experts. But it's not a situation where you're going to be Mark Zuckerberg sitting in California or Hawaii the entire time and just shifting your intellectual property or just going to Belize for a board meeting. You're going to actually, in most cases, need to move. None of this is tax advice, but that's generally what we see historically with folks who are running small businesses where they're the ones making decisions. So you're not running your business like the super rich. That's a big difference. The second thing that is talked about a lot about what wealthy people do is they have stock, and they can borrow against that stock, or they have Bitcoin. And so particularly when Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies were higher, they can borrow against that. And so whether they're going to a bank, as Elon Musk does, and they're saying, hey, I want to borrow against my Tesla stock to go and buy Twitter, or whether they are going to some kind of crypto service provider where they, are getting a loan. Number one, I think this is eventually going to be cracked down on in Western countries. You already see talk of an unrealized capital gains tax, certain kind of de facto wealth taxes. This is going to be something that I think doesn't go on forever because people, the politicians are tired of this, and there's a certain growing mandate in Western countries from the people to say, no mas. But for me, there's a couple problems with this. Number one, I think, can Elon Musk service the debt if he's, putting up Tesla stock to go and buy Twitter? Yeah, probably. I think it adds a dramatic amount of risk that someone who's a real true believer like Elon Musk is willing to accept. Are you willing to accept the added amount of risk that you're going to go out and borrow 20% of your net worth to go and take over some company or go and fund your living expenses or do whatever it is that you want to do? By the way, that debt still has to be serviced from somewhere. And so if whatever you're borrowing the money for fails, you're going to get margin called. You're going to get, if you're in stocks, you're going to, the bill's still going to come due. They're going to come and take the collateral that you put up. And so, for me, especially in a higher interest rate environment, the idea that you want to stay in a country with the idea of, no, I won't sell my stuff, I'll just borrow it. I don't think it's a long-term strategy. I don't think it's going to be as valuable of a strategy with higher interest rates. And I think it adds an inordinate amount of risk for the average entrepreneur. It's one thing to see Elon Musk talk about doing that. It's one thing to see someone who is in crypto, and we have a lot of crypto clients who aren't as concerned about their net worth. We've had people where it's 20 million one day and it's $120 million 6 months later, and they're cool with that. I'm a much more risk-averse person. If I'm at 20 million one day and 120 million, I'm freaking out. I don't want the roller coaster. I just want kind of smooth incremental growth. I like to play it safe. And so this idea of borrowing against everything, to me, is just not sustainable for many people. Certainly for some of the ultra wealthy, but how can you borrow that? I think it's much better to simply say, I'm going to live in a tax-friendly country, whether that could be Ireland or the UAE or Thailand or the Cayman Islands or Panama or Uruguay or you name it, there's dozens of them. I'm just going to live there and I'm going to have a capital gains exemption, or I'm going to have a very low tax rate, or I'm going to have a 10-year tax exemption, or I'm not going to pay tax on foreign gains, or there's no taxes at all. That would be a lot easier to me than playing these kinds of tricks. I'm against tricks. I just like the most organic growth in a business, the most organic way of operating. I don't want to sit around in a country that I don't want to live in and find ways to take tax deductions and I'm going to buy things I don't want to get a write-off, and I'm going to borrow against stock. Why would I want to collateralize something that I want to keep? Because for me, it's when the times are good. You have people who work in our office, by the way, they're too young. They've never seen a recession. They've never seen things go down. I've seen things go down. You probably have too. What happens when things go down? What happens to your borrowing? It's just something that I think a lot of people don't really relate to as much. And yet everyone says with such great confidence, oh, just borrow against it. It's a lot deeper than that. The other thing that I think is going to go away is that the super wealthy uses, they just take advantage of lower tax rates. And so one of the things that Warren Buffett, who I've been following a lot recently, talks about is he pays a lower tax rate than his secretary. Sounds a lot worse than it actually is, because the secretary, the cleaning lady, they're paying payroll tax, which they will eventually get back in benefits. They're also paying an income tax, ostensibly, one would argue, because they live in a country where they're provided with a job. And that's kind of the idea of government. It's almost kind of like a protection racket where, hey, if you're our citizen, we'll make sure you get work, and our politicians will make sure that we're fighting for more job opportunities to come here. Although politicians in Western countries are more pushing for, why doesn't Jeff Bezos just pay for you to sit at home and just send you a $2,000 check? That's the new thing. And so who do you think is going to pay for that? But the big benefit of having U.S. citizenship for most people on Earth is you can get a job in the United States. Now with remote work, certainly you can work for U.S. companies remotely and potentially get U.S. salaries in some cases. But the big push historically has been your citizenship means you can work there. And if it's a high-paying country, you earn a high wage. And so perhaps income tax rates should be higher. And perhaps if you're getting Social Security, getting Medicare when you're older, those taxes should be higher. Why should Bill Gates, why should Jeff Bezos pay Social Security tax on their entire income? If they make $100 million in 1 year, why would they pay Social? Are they going to get a $792,000 a month Social Security check? No, so they shouldn't pay anymore. And if you are passively investing and bringing liquidity to a market, you would argue that you should get a lower tax than someone who's taking work out of the system. I think you're going to see those taxes increase because Logic doesn't matter. People's feelings matter. Countries in the West think they have it made. They're legacy brands, as I call them. They don't believe that they need to be competitive. That's why they're not really attracting high-value immigration in countries like the US and the UK. It's harder to go and say, I'm going to open up some great business and get a residence permit. Much harder than it is in dozens of other countries that we help people move to who want to start businesses there. And so you're going to see, because of that lack of competition, that lack of that competitive culture, taxes probably will go up. And so this idea that the super wealthy are just going to always pay lower tax rates in the West, I don't believe. You also have things like the stepped-up basis, where you accumulate a bunch of assets, you don't pay capital gains tax, you die, and then you pass it on to your heirs, and they just basically assume your basis at death. I think already Joe Biden is targeted to get rid of things like that. And so my approach is, I'm trying to skate to where the puck is going. I'm looking 5, 10, 20, 50 years in the future, and I'm saying, what's going to happen at that point if I'm a successful person? Now, if you are 92 years old, as Warren Buffett is, then maybe you don't need to worry about this because you've lived through the halcyon days of when the U.S. was a better place to invest, even though tax rates were crazy much of the time. If you're going to be around for the next 50 years, do you think some of these tax benefits are going to be there? Or do you think that you're going to have a better tax deal somewhere else? Do you think you're going to be treated more fairly somewhere else? Do you think you're going to have less paperwork, less hassle somewhere else? Do you think you're going to have a better, more welcoming business culture somewhere else? I can tell you it already exists. The U.S. is barely in the top 25 of the world's most competitive economies. It's certainly not 200th. It's not down there with North Korea, but it's getting worse. And there are places where, for the small business owner, for the small investor, you can go and you can get a much better deal. And so this idea that super wealthy people are going to continue to get tax breaks, number one, they don't always apply to you because your small business has to do more actively to offshore itself. I'm telling people that all the time. You don't get some of the deals that Warren Buffett does. Borrowing potentially poses challenges to some folks. I think that this is going to become a more difficult climate. And so if you're relying on tax incentives, understand they don't always exist and understand they're already better somewhere else.